Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Philosophy, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm Malcolm Keating, and today we'll be talking to Stephen Phillips, translator of Gangesha's Tattva Chintamani, or Jewel of Reflection on the Truth About Epistemology, published in 2020 by Bloomsbury Academic Press. Welcome to New Books in Philosophy, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Your book, which has just come out, is a 3-volume, English translation of what's really a masterpiece of Sanskrit language philosophy. And if I'm not mistaken, it's never been translated before in its entirety, certainly not in English. So this is a work by a 14th century philosopher, Gangesha. He lived in northeast India, and we'll talk about his biography in a minute. So he wrote on epistemology, metaphysics, language, and logic, a range of things. And normally what I would do is I ask the author to tell me their book's thesis in a nutshell, but I'm talking to you and not Gangesha, so let me ask you how you would succinctly, if at all possible, give a nutshell of what is Gangesha arguing for in his Tattva Chintamani.
Well, first of all, there is much ellipsis in Gangesha and in philosophic writing in Sanskrit across the board, including Gangesha's title, Tattva Chintamani. Partly, titles are meant to be poetic, and Tattva Chintamani has a double entendre, the double meaning of reflection on the truth. That's what tattva means. But also, a chintamani is a wish-fulfilling jewel. So it's reflection on the truth. And the word that's elided is pramana tattva chintamani. So it's the truth about what? It's the truth about the pramana. So, and actually the elided word in the title pramana gets emphasis, even though it's not there. The book is arranged around 4 pramana, and pramana are knowledge sources. The 4 knowledge sources of perception, inference, analogy, and testimony. Now, analogy is not so familiar to us just as philosophers or human beings, whereas we all get by every day with perception and inference and testimony. So I don't really want to talk a lot about analogy from the get-go, but emphasize rather that there are these 3 very, what shall we say, commonly supposed sources of knowledge: perception, inference, and testimony, learning something new from something told to us by a reliable source. That working out exactly how these 3 sources of knowledge work, and along with, in general, what is knowledge? How do we certify that we know something or other? And various other topics having to do with the specific knowledge sources. The book is divided in Sanskrit into not into 3 volumes, but into 4. 1 for each of the pramana, 1 for each of the knowledge sources. I'm not so sure that Gangesha is himself committed to analogy as a knowledge source, because it gets very short treatment. But Gangesha is, it's important to know from the get-go that he's a member of a long-running school of philosophy known as Nyaya. And Nyaya, he's in the 14th century. Nyaya gets going really early, probably more than 1400 years before him. There's some dispute about the date of the earliest Nyaya text, called the Nyaya Sutra, but maybe 100 BCE or 100 CE, and there's been a long tradition of development of Nyaya, where uh, philosophers try to stay true to the core principles, core positions of Nyaya, but they also expand and elaborate and sometimes totally innovate. Gangesha is famous in classical circles as the originator of what's called New Nyaya, Navya Nyaya. But I've thought a lot about that topic, and some scholars think that his predecessor, Udayana, who lived a couple of centuries before he did, was really the great innovator of Navya Nyaya. But no, every Nyaya philosopher is called a Nyayika. Every Nyayika innovates to some extent and also continues the positions that have been inherited from predecessors. So the very distinction of Navya Nyaya is somewhat problematic, and some later Nyaya philosophers uh, count Gangesha as part of old Nyaya, Nyaya, and only Raghunath, someone about 2 centuries later than Gangesha, as the real innovator of what's called New Nyaya.
So where exactly to place this innovation is controversial. But one thing that you're doing in your translation is giving a new audience a chance to make some of these kinds of conclusions about what's going on philosophically in the text. What do you characterize the goals of your translation as being then? Who are you hoping will read the book? What's the audience? And why do you think Gangesha's work was important to translate? You mentioned Udayana, the Vachaspati Mishra is another philosopher. There's a whole lot of untranslated works in Sanskrit. Why Gangesha?
That's a tough question. It has to do with careerism. Who is both a good philosopher and so worthy to work on, and has not been worked on so much that uh, I feel very privileged to have been trained as an analytic philosopher and as a Sanskritist, because there were any number of works that I could have worked on and have worked on that very few people who know analytic philosophy have worked on. And so, you know, um, some translations of very good philosophic works in Sanskrit um, get um, misrepresented in English by subtle errors concerning epistemic terms. Um, and one has to be very careful and also provide background material so that one doesn't make a terrible mistake, such as to say, as many Sanskrit translators have said, that there can be false knowledge. Now, an analytic philosopher says, false knowledge. Okay, I can't understand that. So they put the book down. So, but that's, mithya jnana, and in Sanskrit, it's really something like false belief, or there's the target is something that can be veridical or non-veridical. So it's not knowledge. we have So one has to be careful in using the terminology in English that not only accurately renders the Sanskrit, but also that ties into the terminology, particularly the technical terms that are commonly employed in analytic thought.
Yeah. Yeah, and so back to Gangesha as a philosopher. Then my question about why Gangesha is
Well,
not meant to suggest that you shouldn't have translated his work. It's just what's great about him.
what's really great about him is I must say I was steered by his reputation. The founder, he was said, in Sanskrit circles, he's often said to be the founder of New Nyaya. Uh, and there are many, many commentaries in Sanskrit written on his work. on single sentences that he has written. For example, the definition of entailment or natural entailment, vyapti. It has had tons of commentary and analysis in Sanskrit, so the tradition directed me to Gangesha, where I admittedly some of the scholarly work, particularly by some very good German scholars and Japanese scholars, would put, as a matter of a world-class philosopher, would put perhaps among Nyaya philosophers, would put Udayana a little higher. After all, Udayana integrated an ontological system that grew up under the name Vaisheshika, or kind of atomism, with the epistemology that's in the Nyaya Sutra and the long-standing Nyaya tradition, and everybody after Udayana, including Gangesha, it has this fusion of ontological categories and epistemology. That goes all the way back to the Nyaya Sutra itself. But I must say, just as a kind of insider point that people probably will not appreciate, Udayana, of all the philosophers that I have tried to read in Sanskrit, I find the most difficult because I don't know if you yourself have tried to read Udayana, but it's highly elliptical, even more. I mean, Gangesha has very long, complex sentences and ellipsis. It's a common feature, but nothing like Udayana. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
really hard.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. I looking at some of the translations on his work that I've tried to teach to students. It's a real challenge. So let's go back to Gangesha then. How did you get interested in Gangesha? How did you come across your radar first?
Again, being a professional philosopher and Sanskritist, Gangesha was a natural choice. The two best known and also most astute combination of philosopher and Sanskritist in the writing in English, and the generation before me were two scholars. One, J.N. Mohanty, and the other, Bimal Motilal. Both of these fellows were had as their specialty Nyaya, and both translated sections of the Tattva Chintamani, a whole, just one section about 1/16 of the perception chapter. Remember, there are 4 chapters in the Tattva Chintamani, the jewel, we call it the jewel of reflection on the truth about epistemology, was translated in the Harvard Oriental series by Motilal, I think in 1968. Mohanty translated a very important section on how we know that we know, but here two, let's say maybe 3/16 of the whole perception chapter have been translated by these very great scholars before me. So and other bits of that chapter have been translated piecemeal, maybe 1 or 2 other sections. Same with the inference chapter. About 20 sections, 4 or 5, been translated here or there in journals. A whole book was devoted to the section on the inferential subject in the inference chapter. And there are only about 40 lines of Sanskrit. So scholarship up to this point of my work had really taken the Tattva Chintamani to be a series of journal articles. And, didn't really have that all together, but actually when you put it all together, you see some larger themes. For example, the default acceptability of the beliefs embedded in fresh awareness, And then a second level, which is what we may call animal knowledge or animal awareness, whether that be so uptake fused with acceptance, with testimony. You're not you just you somebody tells you something, you automatically believe it. You know, so there's this default goodness coupled with defeasibility. And when you look at the inference chapter in particular, you see, but also the perception chapter, a little less with the testimony chapter, that the concern is how is what is presumptively knowledge certified or shown actually not to be knowledge, defeated. The whole last part of the inference chapter, which has not been talked about very much, is concerned with the concept of bodhika. I mentioned the Sanskrit because there's a great English cognate, bodhika, defeater, a blocker. It blocks, a blocker of knowledge. And sometimes you have standing defeaters, but sometimes, I don't know, you say everything that is earthen is scratchable by iron. And you have a lot of inductive evidence for that. But then diamonds are discovered, and so that's a defeater of the vyapti that permits inference. There's some entailment relation that is much concerned with in the inference chapter. So by putting the chapters together, you can sort of see. I think this is a point that not many people have really appreciated, that the whole layout of the epistemology has to do with sort of presumptive acceptability of the beliefs embedded in fresh news, whether that come from perception or inference or testimony, and then concern with what might undercut that belief or certify. And we move to a second level. Now, all philosophic discussions at a second level. So even though we model even certification on the first level of animal knowledge, so that we look at sort of natural inferences and get our model for how to do inference in a formal way. When we come to philosophic issues, it's all, nothing is automatic. Everything has to be argued for. And one of the great joys of reading Sanskrit philosophy, as you know, is unlike English. You think, we're told in graduate school or even undergraduate that the métier of philosophy is argument, and we learn the structures of argument. But I have encountered no work in any Western philosophy from the Greeks through Kripke who have arguments so central to the way that a philosophic text proceeds. Everything has to be supported. And so the genre of philosophy is one where you're always looking for the better reasons.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that for a second. So for our listeners who may not know anything about Indian philosophy, the term inference, I think maybe we should spend a little bit of time unpacking what you mean by that in the context of pramanas, because that's a term that has some ambiguities.
Yes,
What's interesting here?
I should maybe use inference star. I mean, I think of perception. Testimony works better. There's also a problem with the word perception, which is ambiguous, but whether between the process and the result. But you're absolutely right. The word inference in English has much broader semantic range than the word anumana, which is a knowledge taken as one of the basic knowledge sources in Gangesha and Sanskrit philosophy in general. And so it's important. Also, a lot of the reasoning that goes on around an inference or around perception, concerned with certification or defeating, is called tarka. And it has to do with something like the Socratic Elenchus, where you try to show an opponent's position lands in contradiction or infinite regress, it lacks economy compared to some other position. All that reasoning, which really fills out the stuff of philosophical text, that's not really called inference. We might call that inference in English, or inference to the best explanation. That's not what's going on in Sanskrit. Inference is a very uh, tight form where uh, there is an inferential subject. There is some property that is known to qualify the inferential subject. That property is known to stand in an entailment relationship with some other property. And so when you see the property F or somehow, maybe by testimony, as qualifying some individual A, and you know from wide experience and also other testimony that everything that is an F is a G, then you automatically carry out the inference that A is a G. So that that process is looked upon as uh, as inference, and what Westerners would look at, I don't know, as deductive inference with modus ponens or modus tollens or disjunctive. So that gets built into the Sanskrit system. They're surely aware of this, but this pattern, which has an inductive element, how you find out that every F is a G, a lot of focus on that, is what is focused on as a knowledge source.
Mm-hmm. And so what you just mentioned a moment ago with the sort of automatic nature of inference, the anumana kind of inference here, that's what you're calling animal knowledge, or what you've other places called unreflective knowledge. It's
unreflective knowledge, and it's like even if someone tells you, "Hey, smoke," you don't. Oh, wow, let's work that out. Let's see. There must be smoke somewhere. Oh, wherever there's smoke, there's fire. Oh, there must be fire there. No. You get the hell out. Or you get some water, immediately. Uh, and but there are then philosophic inferences, proofs of the existence of God, proofs of atoms, uh, proofs or inferences about the self, which is disputed in Indian philosophy, right? Buddhists denied that there is any self. We have these inferences, and basically the pattern will be there'll be an inference put out with an inferential subject and a prover property that's supposed to be modifying the or qualifying the inferential subject, an entailment relation between the prover property and the property to be proved, sometimes called the probanda, uh, and then the conclusion drawn. But then a lot of discussion will go around filling this out. For example, in one of the inferences that Gangesha takes up for Ishvara, that there is a creator of or a ranger of not of not of stuff, but of atoms, right? Stuff is the atoms themselves are eternal and uncreated, but it's reasoned that, or it's inferred that there has to be a overseer that brings the otherwise disconnected atoms into connection. Now, and so there's an very trim inference that puts forth the case for a Lord, a creative Ishvara, or world arranger Ishvara. But then there'll be some reasoning that fills out the nature of Ishvara, such as Ishvara has to be omniscient, otherwise Ishvara couldn't do the work that Ishvara is inferred, that causes us to infer Ishvara in the first place. It's possible to fill out the conclusion from. It's not just that there is a Lord. What's the Lord like? So there's this supplemental reasoning that goes around the inference that fills in details.
So let's talk about what Gangesha is doing that's innovative or extending earlier Nyaya philosophy, because what you've just described in many ways is kind of standard Nyaya ideas. That there's let's take the smoke and the fire case, because that's maybe easier than the Ishvara one for a moment.
Well,
what does he do with the smoke and fire relationship? That's interesting.
I must say that that the question of where, in what ways Gangesha is an innovator is a really tough question, because it requires a command of the whole tradition that is beyond myself and I think scholarship. After all, just the core Nyaya Sutra commentators, which is Gautama, the Nyaya Sutra, and Vatsyayana, the first commentator, the Bhashya, and Udyotakara, who is elaborating the commentary of Udayana, and then Vachaspati, who writes a lot of notes on Udyotaka, and then Udayana comes along. That runs about, in Sanskrit, maybe what, 3,000 pages?
Yeah, right.
And there are these other figures who are not in the Nyaya Sutra commentarial tradition. If you want, my own sense, look, there's lots of sort of brilliant, succinct definitions, for example, of knowledge that Gangesha gives, of pervasion or entailment that he gives. It's not so much. I mean, as a whole, he has packaged the epistemology in a even though my translation I think runs 1,900 pages, he's packaged it in a very succinct way, where also you see, and this is not really appreciated in Nyaya, you see the coherence relationships. You see how it all hangs together as a. And I think Gangesha is underappreciated, and Nyaya as a whole, for its sense of coherence of a whole epistemological system, indeed a whole worldview, because the epistemology is all wrapped up in ontology, and the ontological questions I think are more difficult to resolve and a little more brittle than the epistemology seems totally worthy of study by the most adept epistemologists of our own day. The ontology doesn't have such strength. I mean, a very simple system of atoms and other basic types of real, and a lot of concern about universals and so on. I mean, this is tied into the epistemology, for example, in the section on testimony, on the chapter on testimony. There's concern. Well, how does a sentence give us new knowledge? And what's the basic relationship between the sentence and the fact that it would convey to a hearer? If a speaker knows the truth and to convey it faithfully, well, it's not just a referential relationship. There's indirect indication, lakshana, and then this notion of lakshana of not following the normal convention of relations between words and objects, but innovating and meaning something in what we might say in English is a metaphoric way. Well, that tool of philosophy of language is then used in the ontological context by some of Gangesha's opponents of the school known as Mimamsa to argue for universals. that we're always indirectly indicating, or there's this sort of metaphorical relationship to the universal when we refer to particulars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just one example of how the ontology gets all bound up with the epistemology, and sometimes I think even Geshe, who's very clear-sighted, does uh, get too absorbed in minor um, ontological concerns, and it's very easy to lose the big picture because they are very intricate issues. I mean, maybe universals, just think of the history of the topic of universals in Western philosophy. I mean, nowadays, after Wittgenstein and a whole bunch of others criticizing him, maybe there are not very many realists about universals, but boy, there sure were in the history of philosophy from Plato to Aristotle and so on. And similarly in Nyaya and other schools of classical Indian philosophy.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football is back, and the best bet you can make is downloading the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It doesn't matter if you're new to gambling or an old pro, FanDuel has something for everyone. And as an official sports betting partner of the NFL, you know your bets are safe. There's also never been a better time to use FanDuel, because right now, you'll get up to $1,000 back if your first bet doesn't win. You can even turn a small wager into a big payday with a same-game parlay bet. Just sign up with the promo code Spotify to place your first bet risk-free on FanDuel Sportsbook. Download FanDuel today. 21 plus and present in Virginia. First online real money wager only. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
This episode is brought to you by Verizon. The experts have spoken. Verizon has been named America's most reliable network by RootMetrics, proving there's only one best network. Best and most reliable based on rankings from the RootMetrics U.S. Root Score Report, dated first half 2021. Your results may vary.
Well, let me try asking the question about pervasion one more time in a different way, and not emphasizing so much the innovation, but what it is that Geshe is doing with what you're calling an entailment or vyapti. One of the things we were just talking about is the idea that with repeated observations, we can secure knowledge of, for instance, the relationship between smoke and fire, so that from the observation that there's smoke in some place, we can infer there's fire in that same place. But there's a worry, right, that's familiar to analytic philosophers, that what if there's a counterexample out there? If we haven't checked for every possible counterexample, what potential number of observations can secure that relationship, right? So what does Geshe say about this? This is something.
He's really. Thank you. That's like batting practice, giving a slow pitch, because he has something very interesting and, to my mind, correct to say on this point. He says, "Look, the skeptic is absolutely right. we're talking about inference as a generator of knowledge about the world. Again, we need to know that the use of the word inference in the corresponding word in Sanskrit, anumana, has much narrower semantic range than inference in English. In particular, we're not talking about verbal entailments. We're talking about factual relations where we know that there is some universal, some general proposition, wherever smoke, there's fire. And here's how we answer the question about, hey, nobody's seen all instances of smoke and no one has seen all instances of fire in their relations. Well, we could be wrong, but we need inference to get along in life. Notice that the skeptic assumes what we call anumana, these factual, these natural inferences in discussing with us, because he or she assumes that when he or she speaks, we're understanding the words that are being said, so that they assume that there is this factual relation between speaking and a hearer understanding. Gangesha uses that example, and he also says, "Hey, well, look, watch the skeptic. Let's look at the behavior. That skeptic wants to get rid of mosquitoes, lights a fire to get some smoke, and to get rid of the mosquitoes. So we realize that we can be wrong, but that doesn't mean that we don't have knowledge. Now, it may be that it's we don't know that we know. In fact, Maya is very specific that normally we don't know that we know. Knowing that you know is so KP does not entail KKP in analytic jargon. That we have to make some special effort. We have to certify, and the processes of certification, the certification conditions are different depending upon not only the knowledge source, perception, inference, or testimony, but also what's known. So we might know that we know. We might take the trouble. Pramanya Nyapti. There's longest and one of the longest and one of the most complicated sections comes right at the beginning. It's entitled this. How do we know that we know? It comes at the beginning of the perception chapter. And there's some, internalists. The Mimamsakas and the Vedantins are internalists on the Sanskrit. So, they think that, no, you don't need certification. That knowledge, they sort of misunderstand the presumptive goodness of awareness, anubhava, as self-certified knowledge. But Gangesha, whereas he fights the skeptic on with these pragmatic arguments that, hey, we need it, we could be wrong, we're not claiming that we know all the way up. We're saying you give us the evidence, we'll give up what we claim. But when it comes to arguing with these self-certificationalists, Mimamsakas and Vedantas, he uses doubt. He says, look, you're walking along, you see a river in the distance, and it is a river. It's a river, but you're in unfamiliar territory. You can doubt whether it's a river, even though your perception, and as you walk up closer, you see, you end up drinking the water from the river. And you make the inference, hey, if my perception had not been knowledge, I wouldn't be drinking this water right now. There's a kind of modus tollens, certificational inference in that case. Sometimes it's misunderstood. actually, certification works by source identification. If you identify something by perception or as having its good origins, so in Sanskrit, everybody's concerned with pedigree. So you got these good origins, the pramana origins. But how do you know you have pramana origins? Well, you identify the source. Well, how do you identify a source? Well, usually, see, these sources are natural processes that are hooking up facts with knowers. And, since there's natural processes, there's always something that's hidden. You never get the whole thing. Just like, I'm looking at Malcolm Keating. I don't see, I'm facing him. I don't see the back of his head. But I still say I see Malcolm Keating. I don't see the whole of Malcolm Keating. You don't get when you identify a knowledge source and certify your knowledge. It's usually by what are called guna and dosha. Guna are excellences, so they're marks. There are marks of the operation of knowledge sources. So they. And that's really a matter of inference. We see that perception in these circumstances has these indicators, these signs. That so we see them, we can certify that this is a veritable perceptual process that's giving us the truth about some fact.
So would one way of distinguishing between, for instance, Mimamsa and Vedanta and Gangesha and Nyaya philosophers here in epistemology, would this work? Tell me if you think this is apt, that for Mimamsa, you either know something or you don't know it. You have an experience that arises, and it either turns out to be knowledge or it doesn't. You can have an obstacle to it and doubt it, but then you regain that same level of knowledge. But for Nyaya, there's unreflective or animal knowledge, and then there's a way in which we can strengthen that knowledge, or we can have a different. There's a sense of almost degrees. I'm not sure if we would want to put it that way. Would that be right?
Yes, very good. And one of the fallacies that I find most interesting that are taken up as the defeaters of what we presume to know, but it can be defeated, is called sat pratipaksha, and I translate this as counter inference. I think most people, other translators do as well. And here's an example. Okay, you say by perception see that there's this individual A that has the property F. And you have had wide experience reinforced by testimony. Everything in your experience, every F has turned out to be a G. And you've done a lot of research and you've heard a lot about this. Every F is a G. And so you infer, and even you're very self-conscious about this, and you present it in a debate, and you say, hey, A is a G. Why? Because A is an F, and every F is a G. Well, then someone comes along and says, hey, and so we would say, and look, and A, let's, in this thought experiment, A really is a G. So, okay, you got knowledge, right? It's true that A is a G, and you have inferred it in the right way. You know that A is an F, and you know that every F is a G. So somebody comes along and says, hey, A is also an H. And you say, oh, yeah, that seems true. And look at this. Every H in our experience correlates with a not G. So I've got this counter inference that A is not a G. It's not a G. Is a not G, on the basis of A's being an H, which you see A is an H, and there's this evidence that every H is not a G. Well, Gangesha's position on this is you knew, you had knowledge before you encountered the counter inference. But after encountering the counter inference, even though the counter inference is a bad inference, it doesn't have a true conclusion. In the terms of the thought experiment, we're assuming that A is really a G. You lose your right to assert that A is a G until you can show what's wrong with the other inference. So
So
that
it's no,
means that
sorry.
there's a social dimension to knowledge. I mean, you may lose something. You lose it. You lose it when somebody comes up and challenges you in a very good way like that.
So would that be then a distinction between losing and gaining knowledge and assertability, or do you think that he's bringing these two things together?
Yeah, he's bringing them together. I mean, assertability goes with having knowledge and also having. I mean, you might even be wrong, of course. I mean, assertability is wider than knowledge in that you you have a false belief, but from your own perspective, it looks good. So you have the right to assert it by Nyaya standards, but you don't have knowledge because it's not true.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you mentioned debates, let's talk a little bit then about the inferences that Gungesha makes in the Jewel that are about metaphysics. Some of these that you mentioned, for instance, the existence of God or the self. Here we see, and you've talked about this in your Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry a bit. Here we see not just his application of inference, but also some of his some hints into how he understands ethical living and so on. So I'm particularly interested in one inference, which is the inference for the self, which Nyaya is well known for these inferences, that there is an immaterial, persisting self, which is the subject of desires and memories and things like this. But here, Gungesha does something interesting. He uses a kind of inference known as negative or absence-only inference, which is itself contentious. Can you say just a little bit about this discussion here? I think it's kind of
Okay.
interesting.
First of all, um, the inferences that he spends the most time with, uh, philosophic inferences where he's asserting the conclusion and defending it at length. The one on the self, the one on the Ishvara, and one on the possibility of liberation, of mukti, of some ultimate summum bonum mystical experience. These three, personally, this may be somewhat a view that indicates a somewhat jaded perspective about writing philosophic texts, but I think that he's picked these inferences because he wants to illustrate his philosophical system, his system of, and particularly the feeders, because he illustrates, they're not only these the most famous fallacies. There are 5 of them, but also the various forms of tarka, such as infinite regress, or and heaviness and lightness, or presupposing what's at issue and begging the question. So he's able, particularly with the Ishvara inference. It's so long. It's gosh. I think it must take me 200 pages to translate that section. That at the end, you're not really sure that that he is actually a theist. He's put up such good objections, but he has illustrated his system of reasoning, not just inference, but Tarka, all the different forms of Tarka and fallacies, and so on, countering fallacies, defeaters, and then defeaters, and then restorers, and so on. He's illustrating it all. Okay, I think the same thing holds for the inference about the self, and he's not really original here, but the idea is we start with a certain ontological system that has 11 substances. And they're the atomic substances, but they're also non-atomic substances, uh, uh, such as ether, which is supposed to be the medium of sound, uh, and manas, and buddhi. Manas is a kind of sensory mind, and buddhi is cognition or mentality. Uh, and, and, and so what he does, he says, look, we find that there are certain phenomena that we're aware of, such as desires, such as knowledge itself, cognition, um, and effort, action. And by various traits of these phenomena, we group them in what we call qualities, properties. Properties maybe in English is broader than the term guna in Sanskrit, but guna is understood through a long tradition, like I say, goes all the way back to the Vaisheshika, sort of sister school to Nyaya that's focused on ontology. All guna qualifies substances. There can't be free-floating guna. Now, there's some arguments about that Gangesha doesn't go into, but they're in the Vaisheshika Sutra, and I think one of them is in the Nyaya Sutra as well, having to do with certain maintenance, black before baking and red after baking of a pot. There's an endurance of a property bearer where the properties change, and several other arguments that converge on the distinction between subject and property, with the conclusion that all properties have to have substances that bear. There are no free-floating properties. Now, you might challenge that, but he starts with that. I mean, that's a given. That a property has to have a property bearer. So, properties such as desire, cognition, effort, and so on, you go down the list. Earthen things, watery things, fiery things, combinations of those, ether, so on. None of those are candidates. We look at other earthen things. They don't have cognition. They don't have desire. So we go through the list, and it's a process of elimination. None of these properties fit as qualifying the various substances on the traditional list. So it has to be some other substance not on the list. We call that Atman, which it's the bearer of psychological properties. QED, there is an Atman. There is a self.
So there's a self because of our inability to observe the right kind of potential bearer for these qualities anywhere else.
That's right.
So epistemologically, though, isn't there something kind of potentially funny going on here with this kind of negative or absence-only inference? Isn't there some kind of background contention about this? Because when we look for smoke and fire, we inductively support our inference from the presence of smoke to the presence of fire by looking to see smoke and fire together. How are we helping ourselves to this thing called Atman based on non-observation?
Based on
well, so in other words, the question about absence-only inference here, its sort of epistemic status is contentious. So I was just curious how Gangesha explains how that works.
Well, there's to tell the truth, again, this is the reason why I don't think his heart is totally into this inference, also like the theistic inference, in that it's sort of the standard view in Nyaya is voiced best by the Nyaya Sutra commentator called Udyotakara, writing the second level of commentary after Vatsyayana. And Udyotakara comes out very clearly and says, hey, we know the Atman or self by perception. And, I see a pot. What does I mean? It means the self. Or better, in the apperception, I see that I see a pot. Now, we don't have to see all of the self, but we are seeing we're seeing the self with one of its properties. Again, I don't see the whole of Malcolm Keating when I'm facing him. Uh, I don't see a whole of the shirt. Not every thread. Um, Surely not the backsides. Uh, so we don't see everything about a self when we perceive, then when we apperceive that the self is qualified by the process of seeing or inferring or thinking or any of the other psychological properties. So I think that that's really the strong background argument. Now, Buddhists come along and say, look, that's wrong. You don't perceive a self, and they have some argument, some inferences that everything is momentary, like clouds, and they have various evidence, and they say, these things are disputed. You can't give us any undisputed examples of endurance over time. And so Gangesha says, okay, since it's like Sat Pratipaksha. Okay, inside Nyaya, we don't really need an inference for the self. We don't need an inference for the self. It's not a controversial. We construct inferences on controversial topics, things that are known by perception. We don't need an inference. Why waste your time? But the Buddhists, these crazy Buddhists, they think they don't perceive a self. So we need some. We don't want to beg the question against them, so that we have this inference. Now, yeah, it's a negative. Yeah, we don't find pots having desire, right? There's a kind of absence there, right? There's an absence of desire. Well, again, I mean, there's nothing so strange about absences. They have a particular kind of logic, in the broad sense of logic. They have to have an absentee. There has to be what's absent, which we have to be familiar with, and there's also got to be a locus. We know that there aren't any horns on rabbits. And the absentee, the counterpositive, the horn has to be something that's perceptible to know that there are no horns on rabbits' heads. The idea is if there were one, we would perceive it. And now, so some absential cognitions aren't like that. But and you might want to say, how do you know that the pot doesn't have desire? Well, again, it's going to be behavior. we don't see the pot getting up and making effort and so on and so forth. We just we would perceive certain indicators of these properties were these things to have them, and we don't find it. We don't find it. But these things have to have a property bearer. So what? So that property bearer we call, the property bearer of psychological properties is the psyche, the self.
Right.
That's how it goes.
Right. And this is where the other, it's not a pramana or knowledge source, but it's a tool, tarka or hypothetical or counterfactual reasoning that would come in and kind of fill in the gaps. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Tarka comes in to show that the opponent's thesis, the materialist thesis, the Buddhist thesis faces unwanted consequences, either infinite regress or contradiction and so on.
Right. So throughout these 3 volumes, the four books in the original Sanskrit, the four pramanas here, what we're really getting, it seems like, is just a whirlwind through a bunch of debates. But these are with Buddhists, with Mimamsa, with Vedanta, but these are embedded within Gangesha's sort of overarching aim of showing this broad system cohering together epistemology, ontology, and so on.
What's fantastic about Indian philosophy is there are these different camps, these different schools and different literatures, and they're internal considerations, but external controversies. And so these shape the philosophic texts of Nyaya. The early texts of Nyaya took Buddhist in the main as opponent to be refuted. Gangesha, he's very much aware of Buddhist positions, but he is fighting mainly with the ritualists, the Mimamsakas, who have a very complex system and literature and factions within the broad Mimamsaka umbrella or under it, and I think Gangesha, he probably taught Mimamsa. He seems to know Mimamsa so well. Though when it comes to ethics, you mentioned ethics, and there's nothing explicit where he, lays out an ethical philosophy in the way Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill does. But Mimamsa is an ethical system. Mimamsa has certain injunctions for the right way to live, dharma, that is articulated by the highest of the caste, and also the defense of the caste system, and so on. And this ethical system is opposed in the Bhagavad Gita and in the Upanishads and other places in Buddhism and Jainism with a much more egalitarian and a system of respect for consciousness, ahimsa, non-injury, not harming anything that has any kind of consciousness. And Gangesha shows in a number of places that he sides with the, I want to call it it's really a kind of soteriological ethics, because you're thought that by practicing non-injury and so on, not only is it good, good for other people, good for animals, you're not hurting them, but it's also good for yourself. You're making progress towards the summum bonum, which is a certain kind of thought of as a certain kind of enlightenment within Buddhism and the Bhagavad Gita, and Gangesha seems to be within the Shaivite religious tradition, opposed to Mimamsa. Though I'm digging this out of some of the examples that he uses, quotations. He doesn't really lay it out as a systematic view.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for taking us through what's just a wealth of philosophy in Sanskrit here. I suppose with the title of the book, that makes sense. Sorry?
There's so much more to talk about. I wanted to talk about Lakshana.
That was my last question. Let's do that for real quick here. What would you want to say about Gangesha and Lakshana, or indication?
Well, just that he has a knockdown argument why reference cannot be the only semantic relation. Also, he has much discussion of the two, that there has to be this other semantic relation where when you say the moon, what you really mean is the beloved's face is like the moon, or you say usher in the sticks. You're not really talking. You're talking about the ascetics that are carrying walking sticks, or the villages in the Gangayam Gosha. So the referentialists want to say, look, by convention, by noticing the convention that ties word and object, we know that sometimes the word Ganga, by convention, means the bank of the river. So we don't need Lakshana, we just need reference. It's just that, Aksha can mean eye or dice. And we just have to know, there's a lot of double, homonyms. You just have to know the conventions. But Gangesha says, look at the thousands of usages we would have to know to understand what people mean when they use the word Ganga, if it's all a matter of reference. However, with this flexible semantic relation of Lakshana, indirect indication, we use context and other cues to figure out what the speaker's intention is when he or she says something that on the surface meaning doesn't make sense, right? So he's very good on that. He's very good on the utility of Lakshana, but he gets kind of bogged down when he looks at all the. He inherits a lot of, a kind of radical referentialism from his Nyaya predecessors, where every word and semantic element has meaning independently of its context in a sentence. Abhihitanvaya vada, as opposed to the Prabhakara holistic view that you put together the meaning in your head and then the sentence as a whole picks out a fact. I actually think he just hadn't made up his mind which system is. He feels like, because it is the standard Nyaya view, all that goes all the way back to Vatsyayana, not Vatsyayana, but to Uddiyodhakara, borrowing from Kumarala, the Mimamsaka, that he has to stay true to that position. But I think he really favors the holistic view of Bhakaras.
Yeah, there's quite a lot in Gangesha that we could dig into if we had several hours, because he goes into language and quite a number of things, but much of what you've written is available on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, at least some introduction.
Gangesha, just GANGESA.
Yeah, and then we'll of course put a link up to the book. Let me ask you one last question though. Now that this monumental effort is complete and the book is out, what are you working on now? What are you working on these days?
I hesitate to say, because there's this misconception of Indian philosophy being all about, hocus pocus, religious topics, yoga, enlightenment, and so on. But that's what I'm working on, Shankara, and some topics in Vedanta. And by the way, Shankara, he's a famous Vedantin, but gosh, does he know Nyaya? And he starts with scripture, the Upanishads, being giving us this animal knowledge, and he even compares scripture as the way that cows know things, and that what we are doing in the Brahma Sutra is certifying by using tarka and reasoning to firm up the conclusions about the self and enlightenment and so on that are given to us in the Upanishads. So Nyaya has very broad range. Everybody knows all the other schools, Buddhist, Vedantin, and other areas of literature, Alankara Shastra, the literary critics, the medical literature, of course the jurisprudence. They learn Nyaya. It's a core topic taught in the tolls, the schools of classical Indian civilization.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll look forward to seeing what you come up with Shankar and Vedanta in the future. And again, I thank you for your time on the podcast.